Music was playing and the people were in a cheery mood. This was a celebration, after all. Even the king, Louis XIV, was there at the young age of 10. It was 1648, and the celebration taking place was the annual Midsummer bonfire in Paris. As part of the celebration, a few cats were also on stage. And the king was about to burn them alive. I'm not making this up, it actually happened. And this wasn't a unique incident either. No, cat burning was at times a popular form of entertainment in medieval Europe, particularly in France and Belgium. According to historian Norman Davis, the people shrieked with laughter as the animals, howling with pain, were singed, roasted, and finally carbonized. Now, in today's world, of course, it doesn't seem like you need to be the next Gandhi or Peter Singer to recognize that burning cats alive for fun is a pretty messed up thing to do. But to the people who attended that celebration, such a concern would have seemed laughable and silly. And I think what's particularly troubling about this story, apart from the unbearable suffering of the animals, is the realization that the people who shrieked with laughter as those cats were tortured were born with pretty much the same brains as you and I. Take the baby version of me and put me with a family in Paris during the 1630s, and maybe I would have been laughing as those cats burned alive, completely failing to notice the moral seriousness of what was happening. A goo-goo. Throughout the history of our species, a consistent finding is that otherwise good and respectable citizens were behaving in ways that, while normal at the time, are now looked back on with horror. And we ask, how could they not see that? Well, would it not be incredibly naive to assume that in the time that we happen to be born, for the first time in the history of human civilization, we've got it all figured out and our moral intuitions can be trusted? That we're not missing something important here, despite that alarming track record of all the generations who came before us? No, I think it's far more reasonable to be on the lookout for serious moral catastrophes that we are failing to notice. Because let's be honest, you don't want to be the modern day equivalent of the guy laughing as cats are burning alive. So with that in mind, here are 3 thought experiments we can use to help us identify our own moral blind spots. I want you to imagine switching places with someone who is experiencing something. It could be almost anything. A bird that is chirping, a man that is being tortured, or a child that's eating ice cream. After switching places, you'll experience it exactly as it would have been experienced by them. So if you were to switch places with a rock that is being tortured, that would feel like nothing, because presumably rocks don't feel anything. But if you switch places with a pig that is being tortured, that would feel like something. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: are there experiences happening that you don't think matter, but would matter to you if you were to experience them yourself? Slave owners would not have whipped their slaves if they had to switch places. And the people who laughed as the cats were burning, they wouldn't have laughed if they had to experience what that must have been like. But what about today? Are there things that seem unimportant to you that would seem very important if you risked switching places? What about switching places with a fish who was dragged up from the water by a hook in their mouth and either beaten against a rock or left in a bucket to suffocate? Would fishing still seem like a good idea? Or what about switching places with a lobster as they're being boiled alive? And what about the suffering in nature? I mean, it would rarely occur to us that animals starving to death in the wild demands any moral urgency at all. Sure, when humans starve to death, that's a tragedy. And when negligent farmers or pet owners starve their animals to death, that's animal abuse. But when animals routinely starve to death in nature, oh no, don't worry, that's the circle of life. You see, what feels like a good reason to not care when we're spectators can seem very unimportant when we run this thought experiment and we're faced with the prospect of switching places. This next one is a thought experiment called the Veil of Ignorance, although we're going to be using a less restricted version. #moral progress. Imagine that before you were born, you're behind a veil of ignorance that prevents you from knowing your own race, gender, your place in society, or even your species. While behind the veil of ignorance, you're asked, which beings should be given rights? Who should be treated kindly, and who can we harm? From this point of view, you might find yourself far more hesitant to say that some group should be left out of our moral circle of consideration. Because when that veil is lifted, you might just find yourself in that very group. I think that many of the people who supported slavery and genocide would probably have thought differently if they were put behind a veil of ignorance, what a bunch of assholes. But what about us? Are we assholes? Let's find out. Well, would we be more generous to poor countries if we knew that our chances of living in a poor country were particularly high? And what about animals? Most of our news, our discussions, and our thoughts concerns other humans, but the great majority of beings on this planet are not human. So our chances of ending up as a human would be extremely low if our life was picked at random. So, under a veil of ignorance, perhaps animal suffering would start being viewed as a moral emergency, or at least more important than football.
Digging in here, just not wanting to give an ounce away.
John Rawls once said, "A just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you'd be willing to enter it in a random place." Now, this thought experiment is similar to the last one, but instead of having to live the life of a randomly picked being, imagine having to live the lives of all beings. You would live the lives of the slaveholders, but also their slaves. You would live the lives of the billionaires, but also the homeless. You'd experience what it's like to be a pig in a gas chamber. You'd experience that quite a lot. In fact, you would spend a great deal of time in factory farms. There are around 100 billion animals being factory farmed at any given moment. You would experience fishing, but you would also experience being fished. And let me tell you, gasping to death in a net somewhere, that wouldn't be a one-off experience for you. There are up to 2.3 trillion fish being fished every year. Everything that's happening in wildlife documentaries, that would be happening to you. And if insects are conscious, then that's going to be how you're going to spend a lot of your time. One estimate suggests that there may be around 10,000 trillion ants. That's over 1 million ants for every one human. Knowing that you will live through everyone's lives, to experience every conscious experience that ever comes into existence, how would you want the world to be? I find these thought experiments interesting, but it's also frightening to know that the vast majority of things we would care about if we took on these perspectives are things that the vast majority of us don't care about at all. And that means that just like the people who came before us, we are probably blind to the tragedies that future generations will be disgusted by. And what makes this even more terrifying is the increasing power that our species is likely to obtain in the future. In the Stone Age, our moral blind spots mattered less because we were less capable of causing harm. But as we become a more powerful species, the burning alive of cats could seem trivial in comparison to the horrors we might create. And so, as our power increases over time, so too does the imperative to make moral progress. And I think we can do this by remembering a question that joins all of these thought experiments together. It's quite simple, only consisting of 5 words. What if it were me? Big thanks to all of my lovely patrons for supporting the channel. I know I haven't been very active lately on YouTube. I've been spending a lot more time on the feature-length documentary that I've been directing over the last few years. We now have a rough cut finished, so that's really exciting. It's been a long journey. We're hoping to have everything wrapped up and finished by the 1st of March in time to enter a film festival. Now, even if the film is finished by the 1st of March, I don't know when it will actually be released. For example, if I submit to film festivals like Sheffield Doc Fest, it would likely be shown in the summer at the film festivals, and then there's still a question of trying to find a distributor, like a streaming platform. So yeah, I can't really say with any certainty whatsoever as to when it will be released, but the project is finally starting to come together. So thank you for the faith if you've supported the project or the channel, because if you're supporting the channel, you're giving me the possibility of spending time on the project. Yeah, can't wait for you guys to see it. And thank you for watching this video. I'll try not to leave it so long next time. I'll see you soon.